Jay Jordan, House member, Florence District 63. I think all of yours is in Florence.
That's correct.
If I'm not mistaken. Some of these districts bleed over into other counties and whatnot. Jay's does not. Jay's agreed to come on this morning and discuss a little bit of what Columbia is doing in regards to public education. We're doing a live Facebook Live segment as we speak. You can watch this nonsense by going to our Facebook page at Live953. I'm not going to ask you to comment on the referendum. That's unfair to you because that's not your baby. I'm sure you got an opinion, and we'll get there at some point in time. But a lot of questions have been around the fact that we're going to vote in February without knowing the outcome of the General Assembly and the potential reform bill that you guys have before you. Is it fair to say that there's an interest in Columbia at reforming public education, and where do you see this playing itself out, Jay?
First off, I thought you were bringing me out here to talk about football. I didn't know. I feel like I've been brought out here under false.
Well, I always tell you things that aren't. You got to mislead these guys to get them to show up. Nah, Jay's a guy that you got to mislead at all.
No, going back, I guess you'd say a little bit to get to that question. You know, when I ran several years ago, we talked a lot about roads and infrastructure, economic development, education. What I've come to understand very clearly is that really those three things could be the same thing to some degree. All those three things connect up tremendously so. You can't have good economic development and growth without good roads and infrastructure. The same is true, of course, of education, and I think that's what's changed over the last few years is that's become our number one issue. Now, it's not the easy issue to jump on. From a political standpoint, you know, most people would tell you to run away, you know, don't look back, keep running. But, you know, I'm thankful that there are those in South Carolina. I give a lot of credit to Speaker Lucas over in Hartsville from the PD. You know, he identified this as the number one priority this year. This is the education year, 2019. And because of that, we've spent a lot of time already looking at dissecting education in South Carolina. And the package has now been put in the system. You know, the bill has been filed. The South Carolina Education Reform Bill has been filed. It's not the cure. It's the starting point. It's not what has been filed will not be what ultimately passes. It's going to go through a long process, a lot of hoops. There'll be a lot of people poking holes at it, and that's a good thing, from teachers to parents to business people. You know, all those folks having a piece of the discussion so that we can fix or begin the process of fixing education. You know, what opened my eyes to it was when you sit in the room and somebody says we're last. And if you want to stay last, that's fine, but that's not, I don't want to be last. I don't want to be last in anything. We used to say, thank goodness for Mississippi, and now they've moved up the chain, and they've passed us by 2 or 3 spots. So last isn't good enough. We got to do something. The starting point, I think, is recognizing, you know, when you go back and look at how we do education in South Carolina, the framework really goes back to the 70s. You know, show me something else, whether it be your business, whether it be, show me anything basically in 2019 that operates like it did in the 70s, 50 years ago. So grasping that this isn't a tweak, this isn't pulling a little lever or shining something up, has been a huge part of understanding how we move forward in education as a state.
Jay, what do you perceive to be the priorities? I mean, I've heard talk of consolidating in some way, shape, or form. I've heard some scuttlebutt about statewide millage or a more equitable way to fund some of the rural districts who've seen their economies not support the quality of education. What do you see as some of the priorities, both from you personally and the body?
Well, I think you have to recognize a couple things. There's a money side of this, and then there's a non-money side of this. We've got to pay teachers more. That's number one. You know, our teachers aren't being paid what they should be paid. And I guess I should qualify that by saying, you know, teachers deserve more than we're going to pay them, even after we give them this raise that I hope and pray we'll push through. But the money that we're trying to get pushed through for increased teacher pay should put us slightly ahead of the Southeast average. That's where we're not competing with, we're not focusing on what is going on in Massachusetts. We're focusing on what's going on in North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee, these other states around us that we're competing with. That's the key word, competing with. So that's sort of one side of this coin. The other side of this is the non-money side of this. You know, when you look at how we fund education, this is what I get a lot of funny looks from when I tell people this. You know, we're last in education, but we don't fund last. If you look at the where we rank and how we fund education, we're either 23 or 24 most of the time.
Middle of the pack.
Right. So this is not a purely money problem. That's the bad news, because if it's a pure money problem, that's an easier fix than a lot of problems. This is a comprehensive problem. This is, and this is an inside and outside the school problem. This is where time has passed and things have changed. You know, we got to do a better job in a lot of areas. We got to do a better job of convincing folks that, you know, they need to make sure they're reading to their kids at an early age, that they're making sure their kids go to bed on time and get a good night's sleep. They're making sure that they back up the authority at school, like they used to, and supporting the teachers when the student comes home. You know, I tell my kids, I'm pretty sure you're not perfect. You know, I learned that every single day. As much as I love them, they're nowhere near perfect, and we tend to look at our kids sometimes and see perfection in our own eyes too much. But backing up and supporting that authority system is something we've got to get back to. Making sure, you said something the other day, I think, on the radio, that, you know, somewhere along the way we convinced ourselves that the education system was the cure for every ill, and it's not. So we've got to go back and fix some of those problems outside of the school. Now, back to what you're talking about, one of the big things that I think will tremendously affect our area is remediation. You know, when a kid finishes school, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here in the education process of a kid. How much time does it take, whether that be at a technical school, whether that be at a 4-year college, or whether that be on-the-job training for the kid to go back and get what they should have gotten previously? That remediation is killing us in South Carolina. We're not communicating like we should be at those different levels. We need to have a better system in place, and this is one of the things I'm really excited about this legislation, that is at least focusing and talking about this issue, so that remediation won't kill us nearly as bad. You know, we're not going to educate, the speaker said the other day, we got to quit educating in silos. We have to have better communication between schools and the next level of schools and the guy hiring people as well.
Jay, when you say that we are last in education, and we look at education in a lot of different lenses and lights, but we're middle of the pack in the way we fund education. Well, as somebody who's not in the General Assembly, somebody who's not in education, I mean, the simple conclusion to draw is, well, money's not the problem. Maybe the misallocating or the reallocating or the efficiency element that is required. I mean, I'm a business guy, and Rev asked me much earlier, you want to run schools like a business. No, I accept that you can't. But there's got to be some principles. There got to be some fundamental economic principles that money's not always the problem. More money's not always the answer. Do you believe that the bill that you guys are dealing with understands clearly that it's not always, you talked about the money issues and the non-money issues. Do you believe there's a consensus? And I understand there's a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different directions this thing could go. But do you believe that at its fundamental core, there's a belief that education probably has enough money if we make it more efficient and modern and revolutionize it, not by asking the taxpayer for more money, but by making sure we're taking the money we have and properly allocating?
No, that's a big part of this. I'd say it like this, to take it to maybe a medical analogy. I think everyone around the table agrees the patient is sick. You know, now we've got to figure out how we cure this patient. How do we build them up? How do we strengthen them? And that's what we're going through the process now, is figuring out, all right, what's the cure to this ailment? And I think what we're identifying through this process, and again, through that middle of the pack statistic on how we fund, is that money is not, you know, this isn't a give them a shot of money and they're going to be up and running around and we're going to jump from 50th to 40th next week just based on the checkbook. That's clear. That's 100% clear. I think the other side of this is, all right, so what is the cure then? And I think that's where we're sort of stumbling through the dark on this problem, and why having input from all these stakeholders, from teachers, from parents, from business people, is where we are in this process. And through this process, we're going to identify, hopefully with much clarity, what some of these cures need to be.
Somebody asked earlier about the lottery money and higher education, the relation it had to that. Explain from your perspective the way you see the lottery money, and its interaction between K through 12 and higher education.
Well, if you go back, here's what happened on that. Back in the 90s, we were sold the idea of, early 90s, mid 90s, I guess it was, that we were sold this idea of, let's get this education lottery and we're going to transform education, and it didn't happen. I would argue part of the reason it didn't happen is because it wasn't a money issue way back then. It wasn't just a money issue. What happened back then, one of the key issues was the money that was already being spent a lot on education went a lot of different places. So you had new money via the lottery money coming in for education, and it got spent on education. But a lot of the old money, we didn't add money to education. We basically kept the same amount of money going to education. We took the old money and spent it in other places.
Correct.
So that was going back in time. I mean, I wasn't on the scene back then, but I would say we were sold a bill of goods to some degree going back in time.
Okay. Having said that, do you think, I want to go back to some of the priorities, because this is important to our listeners, because you guys will get into the weeds on this, and it'll be addressed. The disproportional way that kids are educated. I think the governor put $100 million, if I'm not mistaken, in some of these distressed economic areas. They're buying a large rural. My alma mater, Hannah Pamplico High School, is included in these. Do we have to address education and the lack of funding in this new economy as a result of the global economy is not ravaged metropolitan and urban South Carolina like it has rural. Will that be a part of being addressed to create, and maybe it's, this is a little bit, a little bit big government concept because you're taking from the haves and giving to the have-nots, but do you believe that at the end of the day, there will be a sharing of resources in urban and rural districts?
Well, I'd say this. We're never going to really fix the education problem in rural South Carolina without economic development. We started out talking about those two issues being connected. It's a two-way street, not a one-way street, meaning you don't just get good economic development through good education, meaning it goes back and forth. So what I mean by that is when you get economic growth in these rural areas, that increases your tax base.
Correct.
What the governor's proposing, and I like aspects of his idea, is to take some economic development and try and push it to the rural areas, which is a good thing.
But it's an education dollar. It's commerce dollars.
This is commerce dollars. This is like my dad used to say, give a man a fish he eats today, teach a man to fish he eats for a lifetime. I hate to simplify it that much, but that's really what this is. If we can get economic development in the rural parts of South Carolina, they'll be able to fish and feed themselves.
Last question. Appreciate your time once again. I've looked at the speaker's proposal. I looked at the governor's proposal. There's some agreement in the executive and the legislative. Give us a sense of time frame, because we've got to consider in February whether we vote for $198 million tax increase or not. Give us some sense of how this process evolves in the General Assembly.
Slowly. If you're looking at, if you were comparing the General Assembly to a car, it's not a Ferrari. It's a dump truck with a leaking oil at sometimes, but it's a slow moving, cumbersome vehicle. The legislation has been introduced. It's going to go through multiple hearings. The speaker has made a big deal about saying, we're not going to rush this. We're going to give all the people involved in this, all the people this impacts, the opportunity to speak and be heard and get their input on. This is not something we're trying to cram down anyone's throat, to the point that he's even said we're going to hold hearings on the weekends if we have to make sure that people that are at work or can't get to Columbia, or maybe even take the show on the road and come to different parts of the state, so that, no one can say my voice wasn't, at least I didn't have the opportunity to speak. So because of that, that's going to make this process not a speedy process.
Would it be considered radical reform as it relates to public education? I mean, what we're talking about today, education kind of creeps and creeps and creeps and creeps, and it changes a little bit, and then it changes a little bit. From what I've read and what I hear, there is a consensus to get out of the box this time and do something fairly substantial in revolutionizing public education in South Carolina.
I think that's the goal. I think I'd say, you'd say, what's the goal? I'd say we're not tweaking it. We're really changing it. We're going to take, one of the things I like about what we're doing is we're looking at all the states that have had success that are kind of comparable to us. Go back to the Southeast, the North Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida. Look at the successes those states and the failures those states have had and say, what would work in South Carolina?
Appreciate your time.
Yes, sir.
Very well said, very well explained, and we'll keep up to date with you, and our other House member, Philip Lowe, will be in here periodically to kind of address the goings-on in Columbia as we decide whether or not to support a referendum to raise property tax in District 1 with that as part of this debate and equation.